The reading this morning is from 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 25. In this reading, the apostle explains to the members of the church at Corinth that God's basis for choosing people and for using them in service is very different from that of the world. A reading from the first epistle to the Corinthians. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided, through the foolishness of our proclamation, to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength.
Not surprisingly, the epistle reading from 1 Corinthians and the Mark passage, the gospel reading for the day, run parallel to one another in speaking of the commitment to the cross. From the 8th chapter of Mark. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
These are hard words. Perhaps the most difficult words we hear during the liturgical year. It is Lent, and we expect hard words about the cross, but these words demand some sort of response from us. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we played popular music and talked about the history of pop songs, and one of the most meaningful songs for me in the course of my radio ministry was this song by Dan Fogelberg, which we did not get to, and I don't know that we even quoted it. But it's a song called Netherlands. High on this mountain, the clouds down below, I'm feeling so strong and alive. From this rocky perch, I'll continue to search for the wind and the snow and the sky. Sunny bright mornings and pale moonlit nights keep me from feeling alone. Now I'm learning to fly, and this freedom is like nothing I've ever known. Later in the song, after his soul rises and sings, and I love this, anthems to glory, anthems to love, hymns filled with earthly delight, like the songs that the darkness composes to worship the light. The song concludes, "Once in a vision I came on some woods and stood at a fork in the road. My choices were clear, yet I froze with the fear of not knowing which way to go. One road was simple acceptance of life. The other road offered sweet peace. When I made my decision, my vision became my release. And the song ends there. The singer never reveals which road he chooses, leaving us to decide, I guess, which way we would go. Simple acceptance of life or sweet peace. Maybe we could put up a sign as the disciples come to this fork in the road in their relationship to Jesus. Maybe we could put up one sign that points to the way of the world, and the other would point to God's way. Seems pretty straightforward from the reading from Paul to the Corinthians to the gospel. We could use the terms that Mark uses. One way is the way of human thinking, and the other way is divine thinking. The right way seems to be clear enough. And Peter might have described those two paths as the road to victory and the road to defeat. That according to his understanding of the work of the Messiah. The context of the reading is always important, and in the verses just before this morning's text, Peter has made his great confession. You know what that is, that Jesus is asking his disciples, perhaps as they're gathered around the fire at night, what are people saying? Who do people say that I am? And then he sharpens the focus of the question and says, who do you think that I am? And it's Peter who answers, you are the Messiah. So that must mean taking one of two paths. One path, the one that Peter assumed that Jesus would take, was the road of the Messiah. And the Messiah was understood as being the one who would bring power and glory and victory, mighty conquests. After all, Peter and the disciples were accustomed to seeing Jesus heal the sick and feed masses of people and successfully face off against the corrupt powers of the temple elite. You are the Christ. For Peter, the only other path besides following the Messiah would be the one back home to his boat and the bait. Back to life before Jesus, before he came through town saying, follow me. The fork was clearly marked. Triumph, victory, the whole world. And the other road to Peter would have been just back home. The reading today begins with an ominous prelude, though. Jesus began to teach them. He began to tamper with the road signs, to redefine the fork that lay immediately ahead. Mark summarizes the teaching saying, the Son of Man must go through great suffering and rejection and death. But Jesus also tells of his resurrection 3 days later. But like many of us, Peter doesn't get to the good news part. He's centering on that first part of the message about the suffering and the rejection and being killed. And as Peter listens, he begins to see this victory road that he had imagined following Messiah starting to crumble. He doesn't like what he's hearing. So he takes Jesus aside. Somebody has to take him aside and take the initiative and straighten him out. Peter rebukes Jesus. But before Peter has his say, Jesus turns away from him, looks at the other disciples, and with harsh, cutting words that are among the most familiar in the Bible, he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking as God thinks, but as human beings do." There are two ways to go here, Peter. The divine road or the human road, or to be more blunt, God's way or Satan's way. The temptation of Jesus didn't end in the wilderness, you see. These temptations are coming to Jesus throughout his ministry. And here in Peter's complaint is God's opponent again offering another way besides the way of the cross. I can see Peter putting his arm around Jesus and pulling him a little bit too close for comfort and saying, "Look, Jesus, the way I see this is," and Mark doesn't say much more about that encounter, but Matthew's gospel fleshes it out with Peter saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." Jesus, it doesn't have to be this way. There's a better path, one that doesn't include you getting yourself killed. In a breath, Jesus again renounces the voice of temptation and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Maybe a more gentle way to have said it would be this: "Back me, Peter. You're trying to take the lead, but you've got to get back behind me and follow me." But this wasn't a time to be gentle. It was a time to be hard. But name-calling, Satan, this may be Jesus' way of saying human desire, human ambition, apart from following the narrow way of God, is satanic. Jesus calls Peter and the disciples he leads. Jesus calls the church for which Peter stands. Jesus calls you and me to follow. You remember what Jesus said, that the road to destruction is wide and spacious, and there are many who take it. It's a crowded path. And you may remember the rest when Jesus says, it's a narrow gate and a hard road that leads to life, and only a few find it. If Peter sees a fork in the road now, Jesus invites him down the path that's more difficult to follow. It's the path of self-denial. It's the path of renunciation, surrender, and suffering. It's the path of the cross. It's the path of death. But it's also, ultimately, the path to life. Through the centuries, Christians have followed that path, renouncing evil, abandoning the false gods, letting go of old securities, while remembering always whose is the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. If we choose to follow that path, and we do make that choice daily, we do make that choice every day, we join the saints and the martyrs in surrendering our will to the will of God. There's a fork in the road. Peter was about to lead one way and Jesus the other. We see in Jesus, through the Gospels, we see Jesus continually inciting all those who would come after him to set themselves outside the norms and expectations of their own culture and even their own religion for the sake of the kingdom he proclaimed in word and deed. Someone once said that an example of this would be Jesus' advice to Mary and Martha, who were told to give up their culture's ideals of what women can and cannot do. And another is Jesus' call to the rich young ruler to give up his secure place of honor and even goodness in his own society. Someone else put it this way, that the heart of Christian spirituality is abandonment. The total offering ourselves to God, the God who created us and then recreated us in Jesus Christ. He lists some of the metaphors. This is David Rensberger listing the metaphors of self-denial that pervade the New Testament. Taking up the cross, that one is familiar to us, the seed dying in order to bear fruit, being crucified to the world, dying to sin and living to God, stripping off the old self, putting on the new, they all point to the abandonment of our own self-centered desires and placing all of our hope in the God who raises the crucified Christ from the dead. There's a fork in the road. One road leads to the cross, and it's absurd in our self-centered society, our culture of faster pain relievers, a world of entertainment where nothing's worth doing unless it's fun, the world of competition where the only reason to play is to win, the domain where following the stock market becomes a religious experience. Why would anybody abandon the attachments of this world? Why would anybody take a path that Jesus is beginning to walk here in Mark's gospel? Why would Peter get behind him and follow him down that road? Why would any disciples risk their lives to line up in that parade of absurdity? Why are you here? Why would anybody join the church today if that's what it's all about? Especially if the church has chosen the way of the cross. The young German theologian martyred by the Nazis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, wrote, "Thus it begins, the Christian journey. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls us, he bids us to come and die. The law of Christ is the bearing of the cross, and Bonhoeffer asks how disciples are to know what kind of cross is meant for them. We will know as soon as we begin to follow, he says, and to share his life. I've shared this story before, I think in Sunday school, but maybe from the pulpit. I don't know, I only have so many stories. An angry parent made a call to the campus minister at Duke University, William Willimon. Did I tell this last week? No. The caller was very upset, and began the conversation saying, "I hold you personally responsible for this." And Willimon said, "Who, me?" The father was provoked because his daughter, who had been bound for graduate school, had just informed him that she was going to, using the father's words, throw it all away and go do mission work with the Presbyterians in Haiti. The father shouted into the telephone, "Isn't that absurd? A BS degree in mechanical engineering from Duke, and she's going to dig ditches in Haiti." The campus chaplain replied, "Well, I doubt she's received much training here in the engineering school for that kind of work, but she's probably bright and a fast learner. She'll get the hang of ditch digging in a few months' time." "Look," the father said, "this is no laughing matter. You have behaved irresponsibly to have encouraged her to do this." And Willimon said, "Well, what have I done?" "You've ingratiated yourself to her, filling her head with all that religion stuff. She likes you. And that's why she's being so foolish." Willimon said he tried his best to maintain his composure on the call. He said, "Now look, weren't you the one that had her baptized? And didn't you read her Bible stories and take her to Sunday school? And didn't you send her to Presbyterian Youth Fellowship?" The father stammered, "Well, yes, but don't but me," Willimon said. "It's really your fault that she's gone and believed all that stuff. That she's gone and thrown away everything else on Jesus. Not my fault. You introduced her to Jesus, not me." And there was a pause. And the father said quietly, "But all we wanted was for her to just be a Presbyterian." "Sorry," Willimon said, "but you've messed her up and you've made her a disciple." The road had forked, and she chose the path of selfless discipleship. Here we are in Black History Month, and so it's apt to mention Andrew Young. Some of you know his name, a civil rights leader, a United Church of Christ minister, served as the mayor of Atlanta. That's where I met him. And then later, he became the ambassador to the United Nations. And he tells a similar story about his daughter. He and his wife had been so proud of their eldest daughter. She'd become actively involved in the life of the church. At a time when many young people her age were dropping out, she was getting enthused about it, thriving spiritually, growing in faith and commitment. And then one day she announced to her parents that she wanted to go work for Habitat for Humanity. She wanted to spend her life building houses for people in need. And she wanted to do that in Uganda. Andrew Young tried to talk his daughter out of it. What he wanted for her, he said, was to go to church, meet a nice Christian man, get married, have a family, have a happy life. And Andrew Young says, "What can I do? She tells me she has a call from God." The road forked, and she took the path of self-denial and discipleship. Now, neither daughter's story is as dramatic as Oscar Romero, who is shot as he leads communion, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is hanged, or other contemporary martyrs. These women didn't die in the service of the Lord, but they did give up their lives, the core of their being, to follow after Christ. And I have no doubt that, like Peter, they both learned more about themselves by discovering who Jesus is. There's the paradox in the road. See, the way to self-fulfillment is by self-denial. During the Lenten season, we hope to understand better who Jesus is so that we might know ourselves better. We hope to understand more fully what it was Jesus did, so that we may respond more faithfully by doing for others, in service to others. The flow of this story, moves from who is Jesus, oh, you are the Messiah, to what it means to be the Christ, to suffer, to be rejected, to be killed, but then to rise again. What it means to be his disciple, to follow him. Here, to be a Christian is to follow Jesus on his costly way in an imitation of Christ that brushes aside all the pieties that are associated with taking up your cross. This goes for the jugular of life itself. So on this Sunday in the Lenten season, we stand at a fork in the road. One road may be simple acceptance of life, and the other road may be sweet peace. Which road do you choose? If one road is wide and leads to destruction, and the other's narrow and leads to life, which way do you go? Jesus is starting on the path. Will you follow him? What will you decide? Your decision is kind of crucial. It's crucial.